talked about...
Can we stop for 1 second? I think if somebody could close the door, I could hear it again. Sorry, I can't hear with them. Yeah.
What do you think about the future of media in the United States? You criticized a lot newspaper, television, TV, interactive television, electronic media. You think that everyone can choose his own program, maybe his democracy?
Well, there's nothing inherent in the technology of the media that determines how they're going to be used. The technology is quite neutral. Technology can be used to control, it can be used for liberation and extend democracy. It depends on social forces. So say take the history of the media in the United States. A similar question arose around 1930, about that period when radio was coming into being. There were a lot of conflicts as to whether radio ought to be turned into a purely commercial medium, meaning handed over to big corporations who will run things with advertising and so on, or whether it should also have a public service function. For example, should the labor unions have access to the radio? Should churches have access, or schools, or any popular grouping? And that was in fact fought out for several years, and as usual in the United States, the commercial interests won. And radio became a almost purely corporate outfit through a combination of state decisions and corporate power. Now the same issue arises today. Say take cable. It can, if it is turned over, if corporate pressures, business pressures, enable them to take power over the medium, well, sure, it'll be used to manage and control and so on. If, on the other hand, popular groupings are strong enough to develop counter pressures that will allow them to have some foothold in these new media, it can be quite different. My opinion is probably the first will prevail because the popular pressures are much too weak and the corporate sector has far too many resources along with control of the state. So it's a very unequal battle. But that doesn't mean it's a battle that can't be fought and might possibly be partially won.
What do you think about the difference between the coverage of Vietnam War by television and the Gulf War?
Well, actually, coverage of the Vietnam War was super jingoistic. I mean, what people believe about that is completely false. Both the print press and television presented the Vietnam War from a point of view that is remarkably, super patriotic. The rightness of the U.S. cause was simply taken for granted. It wasn't even under discussion. And in fact, up till today, the same is true. I have written actually a lot on that, and there's plenty of as have others, that's well documented. In the case of the country's changed a lot in the last 30 years, and the press is not as free as before to be pure jingoistic. So as the country has changed and become more democratic and popular sectors have increased, something that developed since the 60s, which has changed the civilization of the country, the culture of the country quite a bit, hasn't affected the institutions. The media, like every other powerful institution, have to respond to those changes in popular culture. So in the case of the Gulf War, there was, I think, probably a little more latitude than in the case of the Vietnam War. Now, you can't really compare the two because there never was a Gulf War. There was just a Gulf slaughter. Remember, a war is something where you have two sides shooting at each other, and that didn't happen in the Gulf. What happened in the Gulf is that the United States and Britain, with France coming along because they thought they could make some money out of it, attacking completely defenseless people who couldn't respond. That's a slaughter, that's not a war. And also it was over in a minute, whereas the Vietnam War, if we measure it properly, went on for about 25 years. So to compare these two things is impossible. Furthermore, in the case of the Vietnam War, the press and television could be, if they wanted, where the fighting was. In the case of the Gulf War, since you were simply trying to destroy defenseless people somewhere else, could be very little direct coverage. Peter Arnett was one of a few others. So the two cases are really not comparable.
In the face of your book, translated in Italy, you spent some words about CNN. Do you think is a new way to information, CNN?
I don't particularly like to comment on television for two reasons. For one thing, I don't watch it a lot. And for another, because in order to seriously study television requires the kind of resources that I don't have. I mean, serious analytic study of television requires extensive resources, and I don't have them. Serious analytic study of the print media is much easier. Now, I have my impressions about television, but it's not like the print media where I have interior documents. My impression about CNN, for what it's worth, is that it's added another voice to the corporate media, which is slightly different than the range of the narrow spectrum of the corporate media generally. They already differ a bit and allow a certain amount of internal diversity, but it's always within an extremely narrow framework. I mean, after all, these are big corporate institutions, parts of bigger conglomerates. They're never going to escape from that framework.
What do you think about the new world order? I mean, you spoke about the decay of the Soviet Empire. What do you think about the relation between Europe, United States, and Japan in the next years?
Well, first of all, we should drop the phrase New World Order. That was just a rhetorical device designed by the executive branch of the U.S. government to try to give some sort of idealistic cover to the war that they insisted upon in the Gulf as part of their effort to avoid a diplomatic solution, which was probably possible. So that's just propaganda and rhetoric. On the other hand, if we turn to the world of reality, world order is constantly changing. It isn't the same now as it was in 1970. In 1970, it wasn't the same as 1950. In fact, it's probable that the major changes since the Second World War were probably those that took place around 1970. And they were sort of marked formally by Richard Nixon's decision to dismantle the post-war economic system. In the international economic system that had been set up after World War II, the Bretton Woods system, the United States was, in effect, the international banker, as well as, of course, the global enforcer. It ensured that everybody would follow the rules, and it was the sort of last resort source for capital. The dollar was the international currency. And that lasted for a time. I mean, Japan and Europe reconstructed from wartime damage. The Vietnam War had a completely unexpected effect, unanticipated effects on the U.S. economy. It was extremely harmful to the U.S. economy and very beneficial to its rivals. Japan and Europe and Canada enriched themselves on contributing to the destruction of Vietnam. They became producers of armaments, backup resources, and so on, which enriched them while the U.S. was fighting against Vietnam. But the war ended up being costly to the United States. It ended up being costly largely because of domestic. The U.S. government couldn't keep the population under control. And therefore, a war is not necessarily harmful to the economy. So World War II was very beneficial to the U.S. economy. But that's because it was a popular war. And you could therefore impose what amounted to a totalitarian structure. Everybody contributed, so you could have, command economy and wage price controls and so on. During the Vietnam War, the population didn't want it. And therefore, they had to fight what they called a guns and butter war, sort of buy off the population while you're fighting the war. And that's economically very dangerous. And in fact, it led to what was called stagflation, combination of stagnation and inflation. In any event, by about 1970, the U.S. relation had declined relative to the other two major powers, and the world entered into this period of what's called tripolarity. Well, that was a major change. Furthermore, when President Nixon dismantled the economic system, that contributed to a huge expansion of unregulated capital. huge amount of unregulated capital in the world that was out of the control of national governments, and the relations between currencies, which had been fixed by Bretton Woods, were gone. Petrodollars came into the picture at that point because of the oil price rise. And at this point, there was also a technological input. The information telecommunications revolution, which was sort of taking place at that time, made it possible to carry out very rapid capital transfers, of huge quantities. All of these things contributed to a quite new situation in which even national governments are now subject to the will of unregulated international capital. Europe just saw this a couple of weeks ago when governments couldn't protect their own currencies. That's even true of the United States, a very rich country. Well, there are about, I think about $160 billion of Treasury securities bought and sold every day. The U.S. is so deeply in debt that it heavily depends on this money. And that means that any social policies that were undertaken in the United States that made the international financial community unhappy at all would lead to a export of capital, raising the interest rates, and a decline in the economy. That's a degree of control over the national economy that never existed before. And everyone is aware of this. Now, this is a new world. At the same time, there was another change when the Soviet Empire collapsed. That changes world order again. It, in effect, in my opinion, returns Eastern Europe to its traditional role as a service area for the West. That's what it was right up until the 20th century. There was a kind of quasi-colonial dependency of the West. It tried to escape from that, and it's now restored to it. What we're seeing now is a kind of Latin Americanization of East Europe. So that's a change in the world, too. All of these things are important, but there's no moment at which a new world order comes about. I mean, you could say that after 1945, a new world order came about because something cataclysmic had happened. But after that, there are changes that reflect shifting power relationships and so on. And they're quite important. I mean, they're having major effects on the industrial societies.
You think so that also Bill Clinton has some problems in this front?
Well, he's not going to have any problems because his positions are basically the same as the others within the very narrow political spectrum. I mean, Clinton is in effect another conservative business candidate, reflecting slightly different ideas about how to deal with the economy and so on. I mean, the U.S. is facing some problems. In fact, if you take a look at the markets, the financial markets, at about the time of Clinton's election, you'll notice that they approved of his election, like the dollar didn't suddenly shoot downwards or anything like that. He immediately received congratulations from the American Chamber of Commerce, the grouping of major businesses, because they regard him, I think correctly, as just kind of another business candidate who may carry out a slightly more rational program than the extremely irrational Reagan-Bush program, which really did harm the country and the economy severely. Now, the U.S. faces real problems today. Everyone has known, at least since the Great Depression, and probably before, that capitalism is a completely unviable system. It couldn't possibly work. So therefore, every country, at least since the 30s and 40s, has had a very heavy component of state intervention and regulation to protect the domestic economy, to overcome market deficiencies and so on. In fact, that goes back right to the beginnings of England's Industrial Revolution. But by the 1930s and 40s, it was just becoming obvious. So every country has what's called an industrial policy. Now, the U.S. did too. Its industrial policy happened to be masked by the Pentagon system. But economically, the whole Pentagon system, meaning the Pentagon and, the Space Agency and the Department of Energy, which produces nuclear weapons, that whole system amounted to a taxpayer subsidy for high technology industry and also a state-guaranteed market for waste production of high technology industry, kind of a cushion for management decisions. It played pretty much the same role that, MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry in Japan, plays. It's kind of comparable, and that the banks play in Germany and so on. I mean, every country has some such arrangement. In the U.S., it was the Pentagon system. Now, you could always, you have to somehow get the public to be willing to pay the costs of high-tech industry when they don't get the profits. And the way it was done was straightforward. You say the Russians are coming, we have to have more missiles, so therefore you have to lower consumption, pay more taxes because we just have to defend ourselves. Well, that's easy to sell. But by the 1980s, that was becoming very hard to sell. And by 1989, it's becoming impossible. Nobody's going to believe you when you say the Russians are coming. I mean, you can say for about a month that Iraq is coming, and maybe for a week that Libya is coming, but it doesn't sell the way it did before. So for that reason alone, some new industrial policy program is going to have to be designed. Another contributing factor is that the cutting edge of technology is in fact shifting. Since the Second World War, it's been primarily electronics. Now it's shifting to some extent to things around biology, biotechnology, genetic engineering, and so on. And that simply requires a different kind of state subsidy. So what you're seeing now is, even at the end of the Reagan administration, is what they call public corporations, meaning what they call government industry cooperation, meaning the public pays the costs and industry gets the profits. That's what spreading to things like even computer chips and certainly biotechnology. Right now, for example, the National Institute of Health is insisting on trying to introduce patent claims on what they think may be gene sequences in the hope of patenting future organisms. There's a huge uproar about this in the international scientific community, but they say openly that they're doing it to guarantee that American commercial corporations will be able to monopolize any new developments that come out of that. Well, that's the kind of, they're now proposing a government industry institution of some sort, corporation of some sort that will support research and development in pre-commercial areas, in areas around biotechnology. Pre-commercial means that as long as it's costly, the public pays. As soon as it becomes profitable, private industry takes over. And Clinton represents that position more than Bush did. And I think the business community recognizes it and sees that it's going to have to happen. And in that respect, sees him as more favorable to their interests. But beyond that, there's not a lot of difference that you can detect.
You think that also the struggle against pollution of Al Gore is interesting for a business?
Pollution?
Yes.
Well, I mean, business is interested in anything that makes profit. That's the way it works. If you're in an industry where you think you can make profit by selling pollution devices, sure, you're interested in dealing with pollution. If you're in an industry where you can make more profit by polluting, you don't want anything done about pollution. But what drives it, I mean, industry cannot be driven by humanitarian impulses. I mean, classical economic theory is absolutely correct on this. If some corporation tried to be driven by humanitarian impulses, it wouldn't be in business very long, because its competitor would be using whatever resources it puts to that to something else and would undercut it. I mean, you can do a little for public relations, like you can have a fringe in which you try to build up public relations. But basically, industry is after profits and market share. Therefore, as long as decisions are in the hands of corporations, we can be pretty sure that the ecological crisis will continue to escalate. Not only are they interested in profits and market shares, but also typically in the short term. Like industry doesn't do very much long-term planning, again, for reasons inherent in the logic of competitive systems. If one component, say if General Motors started to plan for 10 years from now, and Ford didn't, and put those resources into short-term production, it would simply drive General Motors out of the market. So there's strong reasons why there's a tendency towards short-term efforts to maximize gain. And that yields an environmental crisis. Now, how imminent it is depends on the way the numbers work out. So for years, say, conservative business sectors denied that there was any problem with the ozone layer. Well, now the ozone layer is starting to hurt rich white people in the north, so they recognize that there's a problem with that. The greenhouse effect isn't yet hurting rich white people in the north, so the Wall Street Journal will tell you that it's all fraud. When it starts hurting their interests, then they'll be concerned about it, probably too late.
What do you think about the chance that in the United States you have a third party? Sometimes, every 10, 20 years, the people speak about
Actually, it was kind of interesting to see the third party that emerged in this election. When Ross Perot appeared on the scene early this year, he could have just as well dropped from Mars as far as anybody knew. He had no program. He didn't stand for anything. He was just this person who said, I'll save you. And he very quickly had about the same level of support as the two candidates, with no program at all. And what that reveals is something that's well documented. I mean, the general population is highly alienated. They don't trust the political parties. They don't trust the political institutions. They think the economic system has to be changed. They don't trust anything. And in those circumstances, there's plenty of opportunities for sudden changes in the political spectrum. And it could take ugly forms, or it could take positive forms. You could, for example, imagine a religious fundamentalist party that would have positions like, the Iranian mullahs. In fact, if you looked at the Republican convention this year, it wasn't very far from that. The Republican convention opened with a God and country rally that was pre-Enlightenment in its character. And those religious fanatics, fundamentalist fanatics, actually took control of the program. The official Republican Party program is, something that you'd find in some, archaic, pre-modern society. Of course, the party just dumped the program because they're representing business interests, not these crazies. But they, they're powerful enough. I mean, they're working very hard. In fact, they're working at grassroots organizing. A phenomenon that developed this year for the first time is that at the local levels, like towns and so on, candidates where people don't pay a lot of attention to what's going on, all over the country, candidates were elected who turned out to be part of this network. They never made it public they were unknown, but they had organized their own supporters within the religious fundamentalist networks. And they have their own communication systems and plenty of resources. And they had succeeded in electing unknown candidates who turned out to be part of these networks. And they're trying to do that all over the country. It happened on such a scale that I think it was the New York Times even had a couple of front-page stories about it. It's a potentially quite dangerous phenomenon, which could be a kind of a form of religious fascism. That's a possibility, and there are other possibilities. Something like, say, the Rainbow Coalition, though it's now declined, represented real popular interests, which could coalesce and form another grouping. Actually, there are several initiatives now underway for new parties with a sort of progressive cast to them, which could get somewhere.
During our journey in the United States, we were impressed by the changing in sexual uses of the United States. 20 years ago, free sex. Now, the people is really very afraid about sex.
Well, what you're referring to 20 years ago is a particular part of the youth culture, not the rest of the society. And in fact, I think what's happened is that kind of liberal attitudes towards gender issues have extended over the society, not declined. I mean, the fear that you see may be related to fear of AIDS or something like that, which didn't exist 20 years ago. But feminist issues generally, and issues of freeing up relationships, these commitments have considerably extended over the society in the past 20 years. And it's not anymore just a matter of narrow some youth cults. So take, say, for example, the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas matter, the Supreme Court justice. If Anita Hill had brought up her harassment charges 20 years ago, it wouldn't have had any effect. This time, support for feminist issues is strong enough so that they had to make at least a pretense of responding to it.
What do you think about the crisis of the city and the criminality, the high level of criminality in the United States?
Well, state capitalist countries differ a little bit on where they stand in the state capitalist spectrum. And the United States is more toward the capitalist end, as is England. As a result, they suffer catastrophes, just as the third world does, which is forced to accept capitalism. That's what the IMF and the World Bank are about. And if any country to the extent that any country accepts these doctrines, it's going to suffer. Now, in the United States, there isn't much in the way of a kind of social contract, which means a kind of a general agreement, usually forced by popular struggle, by unions or someone, an agreement that people's needs have to be attended to. It's more toward the capitalist end. You take care of yourself, you forget about everyone else. The result is that a second thing that's happening is that the society is, in a certain sense, we've got to be careful about this, being deindustrialized. One effect of the free capital flow and so on is the creation, increasing, accelerated development of a global economy, meaning specifically that, say, in Los Angeles, instead of, which used to be an industrial town, it's much cheaper for the corporate owners to move industry to low-wage areas where high repression keeps wages down. The effect of that is that the former production workers don't have any jobs. What that yields a certain kind, it means that if you, in the boundaries of the country, there's a kind of deindustrialization. For the corporate managers, there's no deindustrialization. In fact, they may have more of a share of world trade than they had before, just being produced elsewhere. And that's a big change, and that leads to big superfluous populations, which are not useful for wealth production. Something has to be done with them. In the absence of a social contract, in the absence of something like, say, health insurance or some sense that people have to be cared for, that combination is very dangerous. It's a combination of a superfluous population, very little in the way of concern for them. There aren't many ways to deal with that. One of the ways is to throw them in jail. And in fact, during the Reagan period, the jail population just boomed, by far the highest per capita in the industrial world. Another way to deal with them is just to coop them up in concentration camps. That's what the inner cities have become. Coop them up in concentration camps where they prey on each other. They have tremendous violence and huge amounts of crime, and of course it seeps out. You can't put walls around it. And these are continuing tendencies. The U.S., in fact, is taking on a kind of third world character. In a typical third world country, there's islands of extreme wealth and privilege and a huge sea of total misery, say Brazil or Mexico or so on. Well, the U.S. isn't there yet, but it's moving in that direction. The proportions are different. It's a much richer country, much more favored, many advantages. But it's moving in that direction, and that's what you see when you walk through an American city. It begins to look like walking through a deeply impoverished third world city. In fact, even the numbers, like take, say, Boston, where I live. The Boston City Hospital now has to have a special clinic for children suffering severe malnutrition, third world levels of malnutrition. That wasn't true before. Since 1982, under the Reagan years, the hunger has increased extraordinarily by tens of millions of people. I mean, maybe affecting maybe on the order of 1 out of 8 children. And in this clinic, over the winter, it gets cold, the number of children going into the clinic increases because parents have to make a kind of an agonizing decision between food and heat. And at the level at which they're forced to live, they can't make that decision. In places like, say, Harlem, the big black ghetto in New York, the life expectancy for black males is about the same as Bangladesh. The health conditions of, say, Cuba are far superior to what's trying to, inner American cities. These are third world properties, and it's increasing as the country gets, as the economy gets more globalized. There's a strong tendency for working people who have gained certain privileges and rights over the years to be useless for the owners as tools of production. They'd rather shift them elsewhere. Same in Europe. I mean, when Germany had big strikes last spring, the chief executive of Daimler-Benz announced, that if there were production strikes, they just shift their production elsewhere, including Russia, the new part of the third world, because they don't want to deal with German workers who've won too many rights. Well, that tendency is more advanced in the United States with its more limited social contract and its tendency slightly more toward the capitalist direction. But it's going to happen everywhere unless these tendencies are reversed.
Excuse me.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Important American newspaper like New York Times, that in Europe we consider very important. How do you think that the corporates, the business can influence newspaper like New York Times?
It's a little bit like asking how corporations can influence General Motors. New York Times is a corporation. It's a big corporation. It's dependent on the rest of the corporate world for survival, not only for capital support, but even for advertising, which is what it makes its money on. It's also heavily dependent on state power for its survival. I agree with you that the New York Times is an important newspaper. Part of the reason is it has direct, it's a direct channel for the flow of government propaganda or information, depending on how you want to look at it. So the New York Times will have, say, a chief diplomatic correspondent who in effect is the spokesman for the State Department in the New York Times. And that's the way the government expresses its point of view, and one wants to know that. And of course, if that chief diplomatic correspondent started to be critical of the government, he'd stop having lunch with the Secretary of State. And the same with the political commentators and so on. So there's all kind of factors that compel the major corporation, the major corporate media, not just the New York Times, the rest of them too, to reflect the interests and concerns of their owners, the buyers of their product, which are advertisers, not readers. Readers are the market that they give to the advertisers, the product that they sell, more or less. And there's all kind of reasons that pressure them to be supportive of private state and private power, which themselves are very closely linked. Now, there are competing pressures, too. There's also a sense of professional integrity and some other things. But these other pressures can't go too far, or the owners and the outside forces will just cut it off. So there's not, it is a very important paper, has enormous resources, it's a lot of coverage, you can find a lot of facts in it, you can find a lot of falsehoods in it, but it's always going to be, in effect, a propaganda organ for major sectors of power. There are institutional reasons for this.
Thank you. I ask you if it's possible to sign. I have to complete with you here, there. Thank you very much. You have just for this.
La primera pregunta és, després de la Segona Guerra Mundial, la política exterior dels Estats Units es dissenya per assegurar als americans, als inversors americans, l'exercici de la cinquena llibertat. Ha canviat algun aspecte d'aquesta qüestió des de la formulació al final de la Segona Guerra Mundial?
Why don't you just tell me in English, then you'll know exactly what you say. Sorry? Can't you just read it in English? You prefer him to translate? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. After the Second World War, the foreign policy of the US was designed to preserve that fifth liberty
was designed to.
Com us dic, la política exterior està dissenyada per mantenir el
fifth liberty.
To preserve the fifth freedom, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So has there been any change?
No.
So recent now from that depart from that kind of design?
Well, there are constantly tactical changes. The policies have to change as contingencies change. But the institutions are stable, and policies flow from institutions, so the policies are stable. It's a corporate state system which has a certain conception of how the world is to be organized. Particularly the third world is to be a service area. That's remained constant. It's changed in scope because now the third world is much bigger than it was in 1945. It now again includes Eastern Europe, which had been removed temporarily from the third world. Now it's back. But they must play their service role. With regard to the industrial countries, the problem is, of course, different from what it was in 1945. I mean, then the problem was to reconstruct them, the United States, and to ensure that they were reconstructed under traditional conservative business rule. and it took some time to achieve that. One of the main purposes at that time was so that there would be markets for U.S. manufacturing production, which, of course, the problem is quite different today. Now there's three major economic blocs, and you have different problems in relation to the major industrial centers. But the policies couldn't change very much because they reflect the same institutional roots, which haven't changed.
Després del col·lapse de la tirania soviètica, els Estats Units consideraran en el futur la diplomàcia com un estorb molest. La diplomàcia és millor diplomàcia. I després de la caiguda de la Unió Soviètica, tenen les mans més lliures per exercir la força als Estats Units en la seva política exterior. Consideraran en el futur la diplomàcia com un estorb molest?
Well, that's another question. After the collapse of
Soviet tyranny,
will the U.S. still use diplomacy as well?
They have the American policy have their hands free for using the force
more than before. Yeah.
Are they going to consider the diplomacy as a
not a useful instrument? You mean? Yeah. Well, actually, American strategic analysts and commentators recognized right away that with Soviet power in decline, that would enable the U.S. to use force more than before. In fact, you can read that in the New York Times in the late 1980s, and they're very happy about it because the Soviet Union had a deterrent effect. The U.S. was always feared to move troops into unprotected areas. The U.S. is a global empire. I mean, the Soviet Union commits its atrocities around its own borders, but the U.S. does all over the world. And if you might run into somebody who's too powerful, you don't want to do it. So, for example, just to take one case, which everybody knows, the U.S. and Britain would never have sent 500,000 troops to the desert 10 years earlier. It would have just been too dangerous. In the unpredictable course of events, the Russians might have gotten involved, in which case everybody's wiped out. So they wouldn't have done it. This time they could do it freely. That frees up the opportunities for the use of force. On the other hand, there are other conflicting factors. Domestic pressures inside the United States are very much opposed to the use of force. And it's much harder to mobilize the population than it was before. And the administration is well aware of this. In fact, leaked government documents point that out, that they have if they ever get involved in conflict, they have to win it rapidly and decisively, they say, because there's no popular support. And that wasn't true 30 years ago. They could go on fighting forever, and it wasn't true traditionally. What effect all of this will have on diplomacy, it's hard to say. I mean, the U.S. has has quite typically been opposed to diplomacy. And the reason is, in the kinds of conflicts in which it's involved. The reason is that it usually has a very weak position. If you're, say in the case of the Vietnam War, the U.S. was always opposed to diplomacy because there was a formula which was agreed upon by everyone that the U.S. was militarily strong but politically weak. Its clients within Vietnam could not possibly sustain themselves politically, and they knew that. So therefore they're opposed to diplomacy. In the Middle East, the U.S. has been trying to block diplomacy in the Arab-Israeli conflict for 20 years because they know they can't get support for the U.S. policy, which is that the world has to keep out. It's U.S. turf, nobody's allowed in, and that there should be no rights for the Palestinians. And that's a very unpopular position, certainly among the Palestinians or in the Arab world. So the U.S. has been opposed to diplomacy. On Central America, during the last decade, when the Central American Peace Accords, the Estipulas Accords of the Central American presidents, that was 1987. I mean, the Russians weren't going to interfere, everybody knew that. But the U.S. still tried to disrupt them, and in fact did disrupt them and dismantled them because its position was weak politically. I mean, there's not going to be any political support for the gangsters and terrorists that the U.S. is backing there. So therefore they opposed the Accords. And I think that's likely to continue. I mean, it's a matter, people are in favor of diplomacy, either if they're so militarily weak that they can't gain their goals in other ways, and that's not true in the United States, or, if they think that they're in such a powerful political position that they can win something by it. And that's not usually the U.S. situation. In fact, very rarely, especially in confrontations with the third world. We're usually taking a highly unpopular position in the region or in the targeted country.
Durant la Guerra del Golf, molts comentaristes van parlar d'un meravellós canvi de rumb en la ONU. A què es referien?
During the Cold War, some commentators spoke of a new direction of the
United Nations.
Of the United States.
Of the United Nations.
What were they referring to?
Well, I mean, it didn't really have much to do with the Gulf War, but the United States has been strongly opposed to the United Nations for about 30 years. And the reason is the United Nations just began to represent other interests, third world interests and so on. The U.S. loved the United Nations back around 1950 when the whole world was had such a disaster that the United Nations was just a servant of the United States, would do what you told it to do. So then they were fine. But through the 1950s and the 1960s, the United Nations began to diversify, and they brought in a lot more countries. There were parts of the United Nations became more democratic. Some of them had a third world orientation, like UNCTAD or UNESCO. So naturally, the U.S. just wanted to destroy them. And in fact, since about roughly 1970, the U.S. has been trying to undermine and dismantle the United Nations. It hasn't paid its debts. It's practically destroyed UNESCO and so on. By now, things are changing. It had nothing to do with the Gulf War. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it's not just collapse. By now, it means that the Russians are even more loyal slaves of the United States than Britain is. The United States tells them to stand on their heads, they'll stand on their heads. So the United States now has actually 4 almost automatic. I mean, France will occasionally make a little bit of noise, but not much. They have 4 automatic votes in the Security Council among the 5 who run it. And China is not going to do more than a gesture or two because they're too much of a trading partner and so on. So basically, the U.S. has in its pocket the Security Council. If you have the Security Council in your pocket, you can disregard the General Assembly, which it does. As a result, the UN is now in favor because the U.S. can control it. And that happened during the Gulf War. The United Nations became very popular in the U.S. press. The New York Times was writing about a sea change. I mean, the way they put it is now that the Russians aren't vetoing everything, the third world has been shut up. We don't have to listen to. There's no more Soviet obstruction or shrill third world voices. Now the UN can return to its the noble ideals of the founders. In fact, it was the United States that was vetoing the resolutions, with Britain in second place. And for the last 20 years, I think there's the Soviet Union barely in the game. It's U.S. and Britain almost entirely, France third. But what the meaning is that now the United Nations will do what we tell it to do. And you can see, interestingly, how that happened. The first UN resolution after the Gulf called for 2 things. One was Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait, and the second was negotiations, immediate negotiations between Iraq and Kuwait on the border issues. Well, the U.S. only wanted the first of those, so the second one disappeared, just disappeared from history. And then comes a series of resolutions up to the late November one, 678, in which the United Nations just grossly violated the UN Charter and just said it washes its hands of the matter, it can't do anything, it's going to let it up to each individual power to use forces it likes. Well, that's just throwing the United Nations out the window. So everyone was delighted with that, of course. The General Assembly, meanwhile, in December, voted overwhelmingly. I think the U.S. and maybe Kuwait and Israel, I suppose, were in opposition, but just an overwhelming vote extending earlier the UN decisions not to permit any military or terrorist action or anything against nuclear installations because it's too dangerous. Well, the U.S. immediately started bombing what they thought were nuclear installations. I mean, they don't care about the United Nations. What they want to do is keep it quiet and under control. So there is a change in the United Nations. It's much more under control because of changes in world power, and therefore it's much less effective and therefore more popular in the United States.
El sistema de postguerra contemplava a Japó i Alemanya com a líders de sistemes regionals dintre de l'ordre global d'hegemonia nord-americana. Continuaré després. Digue-li...
Okay. First part of the question. Japan, el sistema que has dit?
El sistema de postguerra.
Sí, okay, the post-war system regards Japan and Germany as sort of the heads of a regional, regional power in the global system.
Under the hegemony of the United States.
Yeah.
Després de la guerra de Vietnam, l'estructura de l'economia mundial ha canviat.
Yeah, I understood that.
I aquells líders regionals s'han convertit en seriosos competidors.
Yeah. This is the reason that our competitors.
La superioritat econòmica americana està disminuint.
Yeah.
I no obstant el seu gran poder, cada cop té més dificultats per coartar i dominar.
Even if in its power, it has less and less
economic domination
to dominate them.
Què passarà amb el free access ara que el poder econòmic americà ja no és tan abrumador com per permetre que les seves companyies es col·loquin sempre estratègicament en la competició?
What will happen with free access now that its power is not being enough, so that it's the American
firms
cannot be
dominate.
Are not so good
put in strategic points.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's a problem that's being faced. So, for example, during the American steel industry had declined seriously. It wasn't facing actually it wasn't even facing third world competition like South Korea. So the U.S. reacted in a natural way. In the Reagan years, they just completely virtually blocked off the country from steel imports. They just imposed protectionist barriers. They managed to virtually break the union. So the steel industry could recapitalize, and it could now use non-union labor, which is much cheaper. So now the United States has a steel industry again. The U.S. had declined in computer chips. So the government, first of all, rammed through in Japan. They have enough economic power to force Japan to do a lot of things. It's the biggest market for Japan. So they forced on Japan, the state entered to force Japan's markets to accept American chips. And they also set up a government private joint corporation called Semitech, in which the government provides funds and so on. And so the computer chip industry revived. It's now back to a reasonable position. And those are the measures, the kinds of, the Reagan administration was more protectionist than all post-war administrations combined. It actually virtually doubled the number of imports subject to protectionist constraints. It was very different from what it was claimed to be. And that was to try to deal with this problem. And that will continue. That's the way the U.S. economy developed in the first place. That's the way every national economy survives. The only thing we ought to bear in mind is that this talk about the decline of the United States is a little misleading for two reasons. I mean, one reason is it remains the richest and most favored economy in the world by a considerable margin. Another is that you have to be careful how you're defining the United States. I mean, if you're talking about production inside the United States, those geographical boundaries, it's true that it's declining. If you talk about production by U.S.-based corporations, it's probably increasing because we're moving into a kind of internationalization of the economy. So the very notion United States or Germany means a lot less than it meant before. There are too many links. That's the reason why you're getting this kind of world government being established with its own institutions like, the GATT and IMF and the World Bank, which actually just represents the interests of the transnational corporations, and it doesn't matter where they're based. I mean, there's slight differences between, say, France and the United States, but there's overwhelming agreement on serving the interests of the big international corporations and banks. So it's harder to identify the role of the national state, though of course it's still there.
En tot cas, el decliu social sí que és evident.
In any case, the social state decline.
The society may decline, but the corporations may improve their profits. In fact, that's happening. I think, were you there last night? I mentioned last night a there was a big headline in the business press saying, paradox of 1992, economy weak, corporate profit strong.
Resolverà Clinton la ruïna social o als Estats Units tendirà cap a una estructura de tercer món?
Ayudarà Clinton a la estructura social.
Resolverà Clinton la ruïna social americana.
So the social ruin, social state of the country. Would Clinton solve that problem, or will it just to worsen?
First structures of the world.
Well, first of all, he's not much interested. He and the interests he represents don't care much about it. I mean, there may be some gestures. Secondly, even if they tried to do something about it, there isn't much they can do, at least under present conditions. I mean, part of the purpose of the U.S. is now deeply in debt at every level because of the policies of the last 10 years. I mean, the federal government, the states, the localities, even households, in fact, even businesses, are at unprecedented levels of debt. And at the governmental level, this simply excludes the possibility of social action. That was partly the purpose of it. It very sharply limits the possibility for social action. Furthermore, the debt has the effect that U.S. policy is, to a large extent, in the hands of domestic and foreign investors. What debt means is the Treasury Department sells notes or bonds. Somebody buys them. Well, the people who buy them are rich people and corporations and investment firms in the United States or abroad. And if they decide to sell some of their bonds, the interest rate shoots up and the economy starts to collapse. If they don't like some policy, they can signal it very quickly. And that also would limit the possibilities of social policy, but I don't even think they're intended. So, I mean, there may be some cosmetic moves. I mean, let's take, say, healthcare. The United States is the last industrial country that doesn't have a comprehensive healthcare system. The population is overwhelmingly in favor of the normal kind of healthcare system that exists and they say Canadian because it's the only one they've ever heard of, but it's the kind of healthcare system that exists in every industrial society. But that's not even an option in the political system. I mean, neither candidate stood for it, certainly not Clinton.
Continuarà als Estats Units sent l'únic poder militar?
Well, states
I understand. Well, that's true. It has a unique position in military force. Actually, take, say, Britain, which is severely declining economically. It's now sort of in the poverty level for European community states, but militarily, it's one of the strongest powers. That creates an interesting situation, which people are well aware of.
Controlar el tercer món és la tasca tradicional dels Estats Units, però ara són uns altres els que paguen.
So to control the third world is one of the tasks. Yes, now all the people pay for it.
Es cansaran Alemanya i Japó de finançar el dòlar i exigiran el reemborsament dels xecs. Per exemple, ara el Japó està comprant les bases americanes al Pacífic. Alemanya pot fer un exèrcit europeu.
So will Japan and Germany pay for these actions?
Yeah, or will they try to get that?
Try to get through.
Assumiran els competidors econòmics el cost del control econòmic dels americans?
Will they assume the costs of this kind of American?
That's an open question. That's a big question that came up during the Gulf War because Germany and Japan were not in favor of the war. And at first they strongly opposed it. And then the U.S. sort of put a lot of pressure on them and they finally paid for it, but not very willingly. Japan actually is one of the most rapidly militarizing countries in the world. If you look at the rate of military development, Japanese is very high. It's not as high a proportion of the economy in the United States, but it's a very rich economy. They put a couple of % into military. It's a big military. I think it's extremely unlikely. Also, for Europe, problems about the new third world in the East are going to be their military problem. They're much more likely to intervene in, say, the Balkans than the U.S. is. So it's possible that these things will develop. I don't think it's very likely. The reason is, that there's just a general awareness since the Second World War that there cannot be military conflict between major powers. Because if there's military conflict between major powers, there's going to be nothing around but cockroaches. So it's in everybody's interest to avoid military conflict between major powers. And I think that really, and besides, Germany, Japan, and the United States are so integrated economically, even though they're certainly distinct, that the shared interests of international business and banks tends to overwhelm that of the national states. I mean, even if you look at figures on international trade, you can see that trade within a single firm is reaching the scale of trade, outside of firms. And all of that means that there are very strong integrative tendencies that would keep Japan and Germany from developing really independent military force. It's not an impossibility. And say people in Asia are quite worried about Japanese military power. They've got some experiences with it. But it doesn't look very likely, at least in the short term.
Passaré a les últimes preguntes perquè veig que estan esperant.
Sí, és que hi ha una segona i
Com es pot dic que passem a les últimes ja. Com es pot el ciutadà defensar del control del pensament que hi analitzen necessary relations?
How can the citizen defend himself from the thought control that you have analyzed?
There's basically only one way, and that is to overcome isolation. I mean, as long as people are isolated, they can't really, they can decide to ignore what they hear, but they can't do anything about it. And it's extremely difficult when you're isolated to understand what's happening or to work things out or, certainly to do anything about it. So the answer is that there aren't very many ideas in politics, very few ideas. They're always the same. If you want to get anywhere, you have to organize. If people with limited power, limited resources want to achieve anything, whether it's to overcome the propaganda system or to, gain some influence over their lives, they simply have to develop popular organizations which provide a counter-pressure to major centers of power and maybe dissolve those centers of power. To the extent that people can do that, they can defend themselves, not any other way.
El nostre sistema democràtic és un sistema de decisions elitistes. Què és més urgent, ampliar el sistema democràtic pel cantó econòmic o intentar un canvi de mentalitat, de reconstrucció de la consciència crítica?
Our system is...
Our democratic system.
I lost the first part.
Our democratic system is an elite system. What's more urgent, trying to reconstruct the economical life or the mental life?
They can't be separated. They both have it's the same problem. Both the economic crisis and the cultural crisis result from the same concentration of power, and the same with the increasing meaninglessness of political life. They all result from the same concentration of power. You can't deal with one without dealing with the other, except in very minor ways.
En el nostre segle, els nivells de...
Sí, un segon.
Fem les dues últimes,
No, fem dues més i ja està.
En el nostre segle, els nivells de cultura moral i intel·lectual a l'Occident han baixat estrepitosament. Quines són les possibilitats d'una veritable revolució democràtica?
Well, during this centuries of moral values have been declining. What are the prospects of getting a truly democratic society?
I don't think that moral values are declining. I think they're improving among the general population. Certainly in the United States. There's a level of moral consciousness that had never been achieved before. That's why the government can't intervene. They can't use force because the population's against it. That's why they care. They couldn't hide the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill affair. And in general, there's just a large improvement in the moral climate. Whether that can contribute to institutional change, to democratizing the society, depends again on whether it takes an organized form or whether it just remains isolated improvement in values and understanding.
Última pregunta. El potencial emancipatori de la il·lustració es va dissoldre en el pragmatisme de la raó instrumental. Per què ell...
El pragmatisme,
de la raó instrumental. Perquè ell busca l'arrel del socialisme llibertari en la il·lustració. el potencial emancipatori de l'il·lustració
emancipatory potential of illustration
es va dissoldre en el pragmatisme de la raó instrumental.
Yeah, in the pragmatism of instrumental reason. So why do you look the roots of
Socialisme llibertari.
of libertarian socialism in the 18th century?
In the Enlightenment.
In the Enlightenment,
Yeah, I don't agree with the description. I mean, I don't think pragmatic instrumentalism is anything. It's just normal. It's just people's normal effort to try to, get more than their neighbor. I mean, these big fancy words are techniques by which intellectuals try to make themselves look important and delude other people. I mean, there's basically, the ideals of the 18th century were pretty reasonable, I think. I mean, obviously they have to be adapted to a modern world. There's no, in the 18th century they were very much opposed by elite opinion because they had an emancipatory effect, unless they could be turned into new systems of domination. So in the United States, say the American Revolution, there was an influence of the Enlightenment, but it quickly turned into what they wanted, namely rule by the aristocracy and the wealthy. And the values are the same today. Pragmatic instrumentalism is just a technique to cover the usual search for power and profit. In fact, pragmatism, the meaning of pragmatism is nothing more than doing what we tell you to do. You do what we tell you to do, you're pragmatic. Okay, that's a fancy way of saying it.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
You know, I find
Yeah.
the only certainty is uncertainty. It seems that many analysts have lost control of reality. They don't really understand what is happening. And on the other hand, the left has lost much of its discourse and its analysis. When they had the answers, the questions were changed. And the questions is, have these dilemmas of emancipation and equality really changed? The eternal problems.
Well, I understand. I don't think the questions have changed. Of course, they take new forms as conditions change. With regard to the left, depends what we mean by the left. I mean, if one means by the left, say, the Bolshevik tendencies, they were never part of the left in the first place. They were part of the right. So to the extent that people accepted that, it has nothing to do with the left. At least what I would regard as the left, the sort of libertarian left, it certainly it suffered a severe blow at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, the appeal of the Bolshevik Revolution undercut the libertarian left to a considerable extent, and sometimes it was straight violence. I mean, say, take Spain. The libertarian left was wiped out by communist force. It was just, it was communist armies that swept through and wiped out the collectives. But apart from that, the appeal of the authoritarian Leninist model to intellectuals is extremely high. Leninist ideology, in effect, is it provides a kind of a justification for the educated classes to take state power and use the whip themselves instead of having somebody else use it. So naturally, they love it. So it's very popular among third world intellectuals. It's very popular among Western intellectuals. It never had anything to do with the left, but it did undermine the left because sectors that might have moved to an authentic left position tended to drift very easily into that position. So I'm constantly surprised to hear people say, talk about, like say last night, talk about the crisis of the left after the collapse of socialism. Socialism collapsed in Russia in 1970.
17.
I mean, immediately. But insofar as the left is sort of, activists or somebody is caught up in these illusions, well, of course, it weakened the left. With the decline of that system of tyranny, there are new opportunities for the left. I don't see any problem with decline, and I may not take them, but the opportunities are there, and they'll have to face the old problems, well, along with some new ones. I mean, for example, ecological issues didn't seem to be a big problem in 1910, say. I mean, you know, they were, but they weren't seemed to be. You can't avoid them any longer. That's new problems. But not new in principle. I mean, it's still going to require the same kind of libertarian approach, I think, to deal with them.
Yes. Okay, on to question number 2. Anti-patriarchalism and being against patriarchy and socialist feminism have raised new aims and new interpretations of the mechanisms of human oppression. And what is the role of feminist and ecological ideas in a perspective of human emancipation?
Well, my approach to these things is pretty simple-minded. I mean, I don't understand most of what's written by intellectuals about these topics. And I don't try very hard, but I don't understand it. I mean, it seems to me that feminism and the ecological movements have raised concerns that once you see them are obvious, and you don't have to describe them in 3-syllable words. I mean, the environmental crisis is very clear, and there are many manifestations of it, and if you think a little, you can understand others. The rise of feminism, especially since the 60s, has brought to consciousness a form of oppression and domination that had always, you know, maybe you knew about, sort of, but it wasn't in the center of awareness and consciousness. Well, now it is. I don't think new, you know, forms of domination and control have been discovered, just the old ones applied in these conditions. Yeah, you can describe this in very complicated, elaborate ways if you want, and that's the task of intellectuals. After all, they need a job, you know. But it seems to me basically the issues are pretty straightforward, and people can understand them, and it's not too unclear how to try to face them.
Das bis to the next question, right? The agreement.
Yes.
The agreements that were taken in Rio after the Earth Summit seem to reflect the idea, okay, well, we all want to save the world, but we prefer not to do it right now. We really need to have some more economic growth first.
Well, there were no major decisions at the summit because the U.S. refused to allow any decisions. It was quite straightforward. They came in saying they were not going to allow any treaty to be signed, and the U.S. is powerful enough to block it. I don't think much would have happened anyway, but whatever limited agreements could have been made, the U.S. essentially blocked. I mean, technically the biodiversity treaty passed, but if the U.S. doesn't agree, it didn't pass. Just like if the U.S. votes, if there's a vote at the General Assembly of 150 to 1, and the U.S. is the one, it's vetoed. But it's the same point. Actually, the position of the Western powers is a little more complicated than what you expressed. There were some interesting World Bank memos right before the Rio Treaty. You're getting that. Okay.
Summer. He's right.
Okay.
He's on the next question.
So let's go. Yeah.
He was appointed head of Clinton's economic team.
Oh, was he? I didn't hear that. Oh, I didn't see it. Yeah.
I understand.
Well, he's one of the more liberal economists. You know, among the choices, that's probably one of the better choices. Yeah. Among the possible choices, you know.
It's depressing. So, and also otras preguntas sobre Rio?
Yes, no. It's a Clinton question.
The next one, right. You said that in the United States, the different parties have basically the same policies, but they have different social bases. Would you like to expand on that?
Well, the policies of the parties are basically policies of various sectors of the business community. They sometimes differ a little in which sector they represent. So, for example, say, for some years, the Democrats used to reflect more sort of real estate and construction interests, and that made them more sensitive to urban problems because, you know, big real estate developers would like to see federal money go into the cities to improve, you know, and they can build things and get paid for it. So there are minor things like that, but basically they represent a very narrow range of interests. On the other hand, you know, they have to have popular support too, and they try to appeal to somewhat different constituencies. So traditionally the Democrats, at least since the New Deal, have tried to appeal to a working class, to a constituency made up of the old New Deal coalition, working class, minorities, women, various groups that are on the weak side of the power struggle. And the Republicans have tended to be more straightforward representative of the business classes, but they need popular support. So in recent years, they've been appealing to jingoists, religious fundamentalists, which is a big thing in the United States. That means huge portions of the population, and what are called cultural conservatives, meaning people who want to beat people with a whip if they don't do what we say. And that does give a different cast to their policies. I mean, when a government takes power, it's going to have to offer something to its popular constituency. And what they usually offer to it, they're not going to offer it anything in the real decision-making core, because that's fixed. But, they'll say what happens in the judicial system, which business doesn't care about very much. That'll go to the popular sector. So in the Reagan period, the judicial system became extremely reactionary, a big attack on civil rights. In the Clinton years, it will probably, move back the other way, because they've got to appeal to the oppressed part of the population who want to preserve civil rights. And those things are not insignificant. They make a big difference for people's lives, but they don't affect core policies.
Right, so next one's on Europe. What future do you think, what do you think will be the future of the European Union after Maastricht and all these?
Well, it depends a lot on what people of Europe decide to do. As you said at the beginning, the only certain thing is uncertainty. But as things are now going, I think it's easy to see. I mean, in European community terminology, there's this phenomenon called the democratic deficit. The extent to which executive decisions don't reflect parliamentary influences, and that'll only grow. I mean, as tendencies are now going, that deficit will grow. There'll be an effort to insulate European community decisions from the impact, the effect of parliaments, or in fact anything that might reflect popular interests, even marginally. So it'll become a more, and that means it will reflect more and more the interests of the major corporations, including the transnational corporations and the banks and so on. And that's almost inevitable unless some popular reaction to it.
Right.
Next one's on the 5th centenary of the Columbus age. One of your books has just appeared in Spanish on the 5th centenary, which or articles.
Articles, maybe. I have a book coming out on it, but I think it came out in Spanish yet. Yeah.
And would you like to explain your views about the commemoration of the 5th centenary?
I mean, how it was commemorated, or what the issues were?
La manera que se celebraba, o los asuntos relevantes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Columbus and then Vasco da Gama, a few years later, set in motion the conquest of the world by the Europeans. And the Europeans had an enormous, they didn't have superiority in many respects, but they were a much more violent civilization. They had superiority in force, and not just in the military the technology, but even in the kind of cultural violence that supports military technology. This has to do with the history of Europe. I mean, history of wars and mutual massacres and so on and so forth. It was a very ugly place. And what happened is that this fringe of Europe, with its extraordinary commitment to violence and its barbarism and techniques of, I mean, Europeans had, well, one of the historians of the East India Company, a recent historian, pointed out that, he's talking about India, but the same everywhere, he said that for Asians, war was a sport. For Europeans, it was a science. They'd advanced in the techniques of massacre and destructiveness well beyond anyone else. So Europe expanded over the world. It moved into, in Asia, it moved into quite advanced areas. I mean, India was comparable to Europe in the 17th century. And Asia had long had more or less free trading systems, which were quite substantial. Europeans moved into them with their state-centered, violent intrusions, and they took them over. That's what happens. and large parts of Asia were devastated. In the Western Hemisphere, it was just pure genocide. They basically wiped out everybody. I mean, the Spanish were bad enough, but the Spanish, at least tried to preserve some people because they needed them to work in the mines, where incidentally their lifespans were about at the level of Auschwitz workers. But the English settlers had no interest in them at all. They just wanted Lebensraum. They just drove them out or killed them. And it was almost entirely genocidal. And the population of the Western Hemisphere, the population of the Western Hemisphere was virtually eliminated. I mean, not totally, like maybe 100 million people roughly pre-Columbian, and probably 95% of them were dead within 150 years. And then it continued right through the 19th century. Well, that's then it turned into colonization. Meanwhile, say, England, which was kind of leading the pack, there was a fight as to who was going to win. The Dutch essentially drove out the Spanish and the Portuguese. The British drove out the Dutch and essentially replaced the French. And they used their power to destroy Indian industry and create the basis for British industry by protectionist measures and so on. They deindustrialized India and turned it into an agricultural colony while industrializing England. And then it extended over the rest of the world. By the 19th century, all of Europe was in the business of taking over Africa. And, so it continues. Then the United States became the leader and took over in its own way. That's the Columbian era. I mean, it's now called the North-South conflict, but it's it didn't begin with Columbus. Like, say, the colonial relationship between Western Europe and Eastern Europe is actually pre-Columbian. It goes back to the 15th century. Eastern Europe was beginning to underdevelop, in fact, and to become a kind of a colony of the West, which was beginning to develop. And that's pre-Columbian, and it then expanded, of course, through the next years. And we've just, there's essentially been a conquest of the world by what is now Western Europe and its various outposts, and takes new forms now and then, but it's the major theme of, the leading theme of modern history, and that's what the 500 years should have been about.
La cuestión de la cultura que se estandariza y los hábitats.
In 1986, Paul Harrison said that.
No, eso es Paul Harrison. No, it's Paul Harrison.
Who's Paul Harrison? I don't know.
He's a writer on Third World Debt. He said that the whole world is becoming more and more similar. Everywhere is becoming more and more similar, and that culture is becoming standardized on the American model.
Well, there has been a very striking American cultural colonization of the world. That's true. I mean, you can't come to Europe and not see it. Every time I come, it looks more like the United States. And it's true of a lot of the third world, too. You go to Nicaragua, where I have a daughter living, and they're picking up, the teenage kids pick up American clothes, movies, music, and that sort of business. I'm sure that's extending over the world. It's popular culture is being reduced, as usual, to the lowest possible level. And they call it American. It's really kind of TV culture or something like that. And that happens to be mainly American, so it's like sweeping the world. It has very strange effects. It's sweeping the world. I mean, I tell you an example. I was in Holland a couple of years ago and talking to people who work on the media. And at Amsterdam, there was a Center of Media Studies. And they were talking about the fear in the smaller countries like Holland about the effect of the European community in destroying national cultures, because they wonder whether cultures, say places like Holland, can have a cultural industry that'll compete with, say, Germany or something, if there's free interaction, or England or anything. And then he gave me an example. He said that, which was kind of amusing. He said that Austrian radio, state radio, which was a pretty high level, was being undermined by, I guess, television, not radio. Austrian state television was being undermined by American soap operas that were reaching them through Hungary, which was being flooded with this. It was coming up from Hungary into Austria, where people could pick it up, and it was undercutting state television. I mean, it's kind of Gresham's law, cheap stuff will win out.
Good money drives that bad.
Yeah.
I mean, bad money drives
yeah.
that good money.
Y esto lo ha notado esta tendencia.
¿Se lo preguntó?
Sí, se ha notado desde el 86 y ahora. Última visita.
Your last visit to Spain was in 1986. Have you noticed any specific changes since then? What things would you comment on?
Yeah. Well, I really don't like to comment because the impressions are too superficial. I mean, most of the time I'm here, I'm sitting in an auditorium talking to people or something. General impression is, you know, there seems to be, maybe it's totally wrong, a kind of, I'm told, you know, and I sort of sense a little decline, at least among young people, of political interests and involvements. I don't know if that's actually true. It gives a picture. And this kind of cultural colonization, which you see everywhere in Europe. I mean, even in England, which is a little surprising because they tried to keep an authentic culture.
¿Se acaba la Guerra Fría o con
did the Cold War finish with the fall of the Iron Curtain?
Well, the Cold War, in my opinion, that's like asking whether the conflict between the United States and Grenada ended with the Marine occupation, and the answer is it did. The Cold War was one phase of the North-South conflict. I mean, a big piece of the traditional Third World had pulled out, was going on an independent course. Of course, that's intolerable. Had to be overcome. Took a long time. Now it's returning to the Third World, so sure, it's over.
Yeah. So, if that wall is finished, what do you think are the new walls that will arise in its place?
Well, you know, I don't think that, I mean, I see that wall as being something different from what it was. I mean, do you mean as a pretext
the divisions between North and South?
Well, the divisions between North and South have been increasing quite independently of the Cold War, and they'll continue to increase independently of the Cold War. It's just that there's a bigger piece of the South now, namely East Europe, and it will follow the course of the South, presumably. That's what seems to be happening. That's what I'd expect.
Well, entonces de Cuba.
All right, on Cuba. So, who should decide the future of the Castro regime?
People of Cuba.
And how would you describe the Castro regime?
It's a kind of a benign dictatorship. It's highly tyrannical. It's very repressive. It's also created health and welfare standards which are unheard of in the Third World. In fact, they're at first world levels. It's a strange mixture. Now, what it would have done if it had, remember, it's been under constant U.S. attack. I mean, this is a small third world country which had always been a U.S. colony, you know, for a long, long time, and it's you know, can barely survive without U.S. trade because of just its location and the relative power interests. It was immediately under U.S. terrorist attack, which was extraordinary in scale, and in fact is apparently still continuing. It's always been under economic attack, you know, embargoes and this and that, which are again extending. So the very fact that they survived is kind of a miracle. How they would have developed Castro regime without this attack, it's hard to know. What in fact developed is a mixture of an authoritarian system and a lot of very high level of development. That's what the U.S. has always been concerned about. They're afraid it'll be a model that others will want to follow because it's doing so. They never were concerned about Castro's crimes. I mean, by comparison with people the U.S. supports, he looks like a saint, you know. But what they were cared about was the successes, you know, because they might spread the same ideas elsewhere. You know.
Sorry. Your last question.
So, there's a question about the Third World. How should we help the Third World? Should we provide them assistance or aid, or should we try to change Western society towards a sustainable model?
Well, the first way we could help the Third World is by getting our boot off their necks. You know, I mean, first of all, the first thing to do is just stop torturing them. Once we've gotten that far, which would be a huge revolution, we can turn to the problem of what in effect amounts to paying reparations. I mean, the West has been robbing and destroying them for 5 centuries. You know, maybe it's time to do something about it. This couldn't happen without a big change inside the Western societies. And move towards sustainable economies is a large part of it. If the Western societies are going to be oriented towards, you know, maximizing economic growth and monopolizing the world's resources for it, there's going to be no possibility for the third world to reach any standards of decent human life. And in fact, the same will be true for large sectors in the Western societies themselves as they become more like the third world. So yeah, I mean, some kind of sustainable growth is a necessary requirement of maybe sane future planning. If not, there just won't be any future to talk about.
All right. Any question?
So, ¿esto es para mí? ¿Para el blanco y negro?
Sí, no,
Well, esto es para integrar también.
Sí.
Yeah, right.
No, es que viene después archipiélago.
Right. So this was one on human nature. I'm a linguist. I'm interested in language and other things like this. Could you just very briefly explain your idea, your understanding of human nature and human language? And what does the phenomenon of human language tell us about human thought?
Well, here we have to distinguish between what you might call,
Yes, it's okay.
I mean, here you want to distinguish between reasonably well-founded knowledge and pure speculation. In the area of reasonably well-founded understanding, what we know about language is mostly about the mechanics of it. You know, we know, it's now, which is a lot, actually. Things are now understood about some quite, you know, remarkable features about humans. I mean, it's how are they capable of developing these extremely complex systems? What kind of systems are they? How do they make it possible to express thoughts and so on? A lot of that is understood in real progress. On the other hand, you know, how people use language, nobody understands anything. I mean, at least at a scientific level, how people do what you and I are now doing is completely beyond anybody's comprehension. And there's not even any bad ideas about it. You know, it's just virtually nothing to say. People speak in some way that is innovative and appropriate and so on, but how they do it, nobody knows. I mean, there's things known about how what I say gets interpreted in your brain, but not questions that go more to human thought and action. As soon as you start talking about those things, we're talking about speculation. And, you know, and speculations are heavily influenced by hopes, of course. So, I mean, I can give you mine, other people give you theirs, but they're not based on any solid understanding of anything. I mean, I hope, say, that the tradition that held that humans have a kind of instinct for freedom and will try to maximize their own freedom and that of others, that they have a sense of solidarity and sympathy. I hope that those things are true and are part of human nature. If not, we're in a lot of trouble.
I think that is one of the great lessons of ecology, that human beings are free animals, that there is no equivalent of a master in the human society, in nature.
Right.
Okay. Right. Sorry, I have one question. Oh, Jordi, sister. No, this was on behalf of Rojo Negro, the paper of the anarcho-syndicalist CGT. A large proportion of our members work in car factories like General Motors, like Ford. You were writing articles about the CGT, the CNT, before half of the members of our union were born. What advice would you give our members who work in a car factory?
They know a lot more about that problem than I do. You know, I mean,
talk about solidarity.
Yeah, but you know, they know all that. You know, I mean, how can I give advice to people facing real problems? I mean, look, it's obvious in general what's going to go on. General Motors, for example, is moving its production to the lowest wage areas it can find. Right now, it's closing down production in North America and moving it to places like Mexico and East Germany because they can get more repressed labor. If Spanish labor gets, as long as the decision about where to produce is made in the General Motors executive offices, the only way Spanish workers are going to have jobs in General Motors factories is to be as repressed as people in the third world. No, the answer, there's nothing much that they can do about that fact sitting in Spain. What has to be done is the creation of a international working people's solidarity at the level of the automatic solidarity of international corporations. That's a big job. I mean, in the United States, it's just barely beginning to happen with the U.S. and Mexico, way too late. But the U.S. labor unions, or what's left of them, are finally beginning to understand that unless they become concerned with the conditions of labor in Central America and Mexico, they're not going to have any members anymore. I mean, as long as the American government can, send death squads to kill union organizers, which is what it amounts to, they're only going to get cheaper labor in Central America or Mexico than they'll get in the United States. And the future for American workers is dim. It's interesting that this is barely beginning to reach the public consciousness. Actually, even made the political campaign when there was an inquiry in which somebody with hidden cameras went to Central America, a union organizer, pretending to be a businessman who wanted to open a factory. And the embassy people told him, how great it would be to come down there because all the workers are that big database. And any worker who's ever opened his mouth about anything, you don't have to hire them. And there are no unions, and you can replace your whole workforce every year, so you don't have to pay with benefits. Well, all this was taped, with hidden cameras, and it was actually played over television. So it made a kind of a furor, and Clinton had to make some speeches about it and so on. But, this is, it's reaching the right issue. There has to be international solidarity, or else the cheap, highly repressed labor in the third world will increasingly be used by the transnationals to undercut Western workers and their standards. If you're an executive in Mercedes or General Motors, why should you pay German workers, who've won too many benefits, when you can move over to Poland and they have no benefits?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Hi.
Oh, I'm sorry. You've got so much work today.
This
Very short thing, and then just go to a stop.